Inspired by sound.
Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to another Inspired by Sound video, but this one is a little different. For one thing, there's no actual video on your screens at this time, and for another, I'm joined by Mr. Patrick Perdue, co-host of this particular show. This is about him, not me.
Really?
Artist Spotlight. Yeah, I know. Artist Spotlight 01. How do you feel about that?
Well, I feel like I'm inspired by sound, and the only reason I feel like that is because I'm the guy that's responsible for saying inspired by sound, on all these inspired by sound videos, except it sounds a little better than that, of course. I mean, there are...
It's funny, isn't it? Because you came into it quite early. I think I got you in from like video 3 or 4. I was like, I need a thing. Can you please help me make this thing? And you did.
And I did. And so, well, I don't know. What are we gonna talk about? We don't even know what we're gonna talk about. Actually, we have some ideas.
We have a few ideas.
We have a few ideas, but we don't really know where this is actually gonna end up.
No, and that's kind of the funnest part about this whole channel idea. I haven't even sent him a list of questions, so we're gonna wing it and sling it. But one of my first questions to you, which kind of relates to the channel, is, well, what do you actually consider yourself to be? Do you consider yourself to be a musician, a sound designer, someone who likes custard pies? I mean, tell me a bit about you.
Okay, well, I guess I'm kind of a musician. I don't really consider myself to be a performing musician. Like I haven't been on stage in years. Like I'm not really comfortable in stage. I kind of like the spotlight to be completely behind me, as it were. I like to mess around with buttons and knobs. That's my thing, buttons and knobs.
Yes, I love buttons and knobs. What was that? Why did it make a bad noise at me?
One of the things that I actually do at the moment, as primarily I edit podcasts and spoken word material. What I really enjoy doing, though, I like designing sounds. I like coming up with strange ideas, and I like making promos and IDs for things. Unfortunately, I don't get to do that as much as I would like. And the odd musical thing as well. We've done some collaborations, me and you, back in the day, especially. And we should do more because they're fun. But
well, there's lots of opportunity to do more now that we're both in the same door space, at least in part.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've been playing with Logic a little bit, which is great. I'm really a Reaper guy when it comes to editing audio. I just haven't gotten to grips with some of the finer points of Logic for that kind of thing. But I really like Logic for the musical aspect of things. Not to say that Reaper is bad at it, but it's an entirely different workflow. And it's another thing to add to the toolbox.
I agree, and actually I would like to learn the video side of Reaper editing, because for some of the videos I would like to be able to edit.
Yeah, so would I.
Most people that don't know, I just slap things together.
Yeah, I've done some basic stuff. It's a lot like editing audio. It's not really that much different. There are only a couple of things you need to know, and once you figure out one, you can pretty much figure out the other. But it's one of the thing that's interesting about Reaper is that it doesn't put you in a box. Like Logic, even Logic does to an extent put you in. This is kind of a work area. This is sort of what you'll be doing. This is kind of some expectations. Reaper's like, okay, here's some batteries. Here's a floor. Here's a wall. Here's a random panel of things. And here's a box of nails. Build whatever you want in whatever configuration you want. Some people aren't very comfortable with that because they want some kind of boundary of some sort. But it, at the same time, means that you can do literally whatever you want. You can make crazy routes that don't make any sense. It'll let you do it. You can route things into themselves. You can, send things to places they ought not to go. And if they sound good, well, who cares? I mean, that's kind of how Reaper works.
Yes.
It's really pretty fascinating.
Actually. And for its price tag as well, we should definitely mention the price tag of Reaper, because it will impress people that don't know about it.
It's $60. Well, they have 2 licenses. The basic one is $60. And I think it's the government/enterprise one is like $200 or something. It's really kind of amazing, actually, for all the stuff you get.
Yes, and it even works with the stuff that I use in other videos that aren't these. It allows you to use Complete and all these fun plugins. It does audio and MIDI, and it's very good at all of these things, which is why I'd like to learn it as a secondary focus, because Logic is my primary. But there's nothing wrong with having more tools in the tool basket. Now, I've had this discussion with a lot of people, and I'll ask you, I often tell people you can't build a house with just a hammer or even just a chisel. You need all these different things.
Right.
But a lot of people want to work in one basket. I don't agree with this philosophy. And I wonder what your take on that is, because as someone who does what you do for a living, you must find that there's more than one tool for the job.
Oh, goodness, yeah. I mean, I primarily edit in Reaper these days, as far as getting from A to B to C. That's all pretty much done in Reaper. But there are certain things that I do, a lot of specialized things mostly, that you wouldn't catch me doing in any DAW. It doesn't matter what DAW it is, just because of the natures of, how these things work. Some things you just have to do destructively, and so for that, I still keep a copy of SoundForge around. As clunky as it kind of is these days, one of the things that I do on a regular basis is I'm sure there's an actual word for it, but mouth clicks that people make when they're speaking are incredibly annoying to me. And because I edit podcasts, one of the things I like to do is make them go away. And there are tools that you can use to do that. A lot of what I do is manual interpolation. It's like literally taking an iron and sort of just scooting across it back and forth until you get all the creases out. And that kind of work is just so much easier to do destructively. I could technically do it in a DAW, but it takes like 3 times as long. And it's one of those things, once you do it once and it's in the source and you have your track stemmed out with all the things that you need in that source, you don't have to worry about it again. You can import it into your project and it's done. It doesn't take up any additional processor to make it happen again and again, in real time as these things work. Same for noise reduction. I mean, depending on what kind of noise reduction you're doing, there are way many tools out there, and I wouldn't say that one tool is any better than the other. I mean, I've played with a bunch of different products, and I always find a use for something. I always find a use for one thing, even if there's one thing out of a suite of like 20 plugins, and that one thing is the only thing I ever end up using out of that, that suite of 20 plugins. I'll keep it around just for the one thing, because you always find use for something.
Yeah, I think that's true as well. SoundForge is also my backup go-to. Before I learned, for example, that Logic had a nice fade out to end function, I would be taking my projects into SoundForge and topping and tailing them. And the reason is, as I found out the hard way, is that, for example, if I finished a piece that has a long reverb tail on it, that tail could be longer than the actual piece. Because the thing will wait till inf to finish. And for those unsure of what I mean by that, I mean, like, the signal has to completely die to nothing before Logic will stop recording. And this is true not just of Logic, other things too, possibly.
Reaper doesn't do that. If you have a thing like that's 2 bars long and it ends on bar 2 and you have a reverb tail, you have to account for that tail or it'll just cut it off.
There's a box, I think, in the render dialog for Reaper.
There is, yeah, but if you don't know that's there, and I've seen a lot of people
I've seen people not do that.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of people make that mistake. That's just another example of how Reaper doesn't bother holding your hand. I mean, you can do whatever you want with it, but you
can
kind of have to know a little bit about what you want.
I think it's great, though, that there's so much choice these days. I mean, in terms of visual impairment, there's Samplitude out there in Logic and Reaper and Pro Tools, but you just have to use whatever works for you. Now, like, in terms of sound design, how would you go about, let's say, making a sound of a wet cabbage hitting the wall? And what would you use to make... I know, I'm just thinking aloud here, because Foley is an interesting art, and I don't do Foley myself. For sound design, I do sounds for apps and things like that, but you've done all sorts of crazy stuff. So show us about the crazy stuff.
I don't know.
With examples.
It's
by the time they hear it, there'll be noises in here.
It's kind of funny because it's one of those things if you say, okay, I want this sound... And I have to, I don't really always think about exactly from start to finish, how would I make that happen? I mean, let's see, wet cabbage hitting the floor or the wall or something. Let's see, I might do something with wet paper. I might actually, take a toilet roll and get it wet and do, unravel it and do something really terrible and then mic it up and then see if that works. And if it doesn't, I might try something else. I mean, sometimes I'll try 12 different things and then eventually end up using either one thing or all of them somehow combined. It's amazing when you think about stuff like Foley, you don't necessarily think, oh, this thing and that thing could possibly never go together until they actually do. And you don't think about it until you actually do it because it doesn't make sense unless you do it. And just experiment with things. That's the interesting thing is like most of what I do, I like I said, I haven't really been doing a lot of sound designing lately, mostly because other things have been taking up my time. But one of the things that I really enjoy doing is trying to get whatever is actually happening in a quote unquote real space, a real believable space that you can listen to, even if it's just a linear, not necessarily like a binaural 3D soundscape, but just something that's in front of you that you can say, okay, this particular thing is in this part of the spectrum, and you can tell it's there, and there are other things around it. I like to put in all these details, like way off in the background.
Details matter, people.
Yeah, they do.
And it gives realism to your piece.
And a lot of times it's the details that you don't notice because they're so not obvious until you take them away. And then you're like, where's that? Oh, okay.
Where's that? Yeah. So, for example, if you don't mind, I'd like to go for a drive.
Okay.
So if we could walk outside.
All right. Yeah, okay. Hang on. We can do that. What kind of car do you want to drive in? What sort of era? What kind of road? I mean, we should make all these distinctions.
Yeah, this is a good point right here. So let's see. It's going to be a slightly bumpy road, but it'll be kind of country heading into a village. Into a city, sorry. So, you know, there's things like that to consider. Right. And since you're the one in the driver's seat today, even though I'm the Inspired by Sound
I'll be on the left.
I should be on the other side.
It's America. Welcome to the left side of the car from me, and how you doing over there? I bet it feels weird to be on that side.
Yeah, I got used to that a bit in Berlin and Estonia, but it still bothers me.
I can understand, I really can. You know, the first time I went to... It's funny, because the first time I went to England, it didn't really bother me that I was on the left side. The thing that kind of freaked me out, and this goes into a whole nother topic, is when we passed under the power lines, and it was a 50 hertz hum, and I was like, I'm in a different country now. Okay.
And it shows. It's an immediate thing, isn't it?
It really is.
I was disappointed, actually, when I went to the Caribbean, because I went to Barbados, and instead of a 60 or a 120, I got a 50 or a 100, and I was like, oh man, but you use 2-pin plugs. Why is it that? And I was completely baffled by this. I didn't know that was going to be a thing.
Oh man.
So here I am in the Caribbean, normal UK driving laws, so I was actually sitting in the left passenger seat, unlike now, and here's this normal 50 to me, and I was expecting to be blown away by, oh my gosh, it hums different. But speaking of things that are wrong, and this is what's wrong, when dramas get the sounds wrong, I think this could open up a whole ranty soapbox of goodness. Take it away. What annoys you the most about dramas and things that get sound wrong? Because it annoys me. It must be terrible for you.
Okay, so you mentioned, well, maybe you didn't quite mention this, but we'll lead into it because it makes sense. The BBC, for whatever reason, the BBC particularly, and they are the people that should, I think, know the best about this, and they totally don't sometimes. You'll be, in the UK or in Europe or something in one of these radio dramas, and you'll hear something like that. That doesn't happen. That doesn't happen there. That's a 60 hertz based buzzy doorbell or, generic buzzer noise.
What it should be is...
Yeah, but more often than not these days, it's not. And the thing that really bugs me about that is the BBC, they actually made their own sound library. They recorded things in their own backyard. Why are they doing this to me? I don't understand.
And then you have reverb problems in other dramas, or even the same dramas. And I hate mono reverb when the actors are clearly panned in stereo. And
there's that too.
Again, believability is key. You've got to get this thing right, or don't do it, please.
The other thing that a lot of people seem to do, fortunately, I haven't heard this in too many modern-ish productions, and I say like within the last 20 years, although it happens occasionally, is one of the things, and I'll demonstrate this. I'll demonstrate why this doesn't work. So here's what the typical mistake tends to be. Let's say I'm walking from left to right, kind of slowly, and just walking back and forth and existing. Well, see, in a normal configuration, you're walking and you have walls and stuff, right? And your walls, you might be coming up near a wall. You don't necessarily hear that from a central perspective. You're just kind of standing somewhere in the room. But what actually ends up happening is with these total stupid production things that occur is when you're panning the source from left to right, it's actually also panning the balance between left and right on the reverb source, which means essentially when I go over here to the left, you're turning down the volume to the right, which means that the reverb is also following you and is not very awesome at all, not very realistic sounding. You don't hear the reflections from the walls that you would normally be missing from the other side. You don't really hear much of anything on the other side after the decay. And that's a big mistake that I've seen way too many people that should know better make.
Life doesn't feel or sound like that.
No, it doesn't.
Very rarely does it. In fact, I can't think of anything, unless you have your head inside of a glass sliding door and your nose chopped off.
No, but you'd have to have half your head in the sliding door.
Half your head, yes.
Part of your nose
Beg your
chopped
pardon.
off in order to make that work.
Part of you, yes. So why is it okay in drama? And these people should know better. It's like bad video editing or bad photography. It has to be done right, and I don't understand why people get it
Punch-ins
wrong.
in songs. If we're going to go in there, have you noticed that? Really obvious punch-ins in songs are just as bad as this kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorite examples is actually from Yes, and I'll just play a tiny little clip of that. I mean tiny, like 3 seconds long. Here it is, clip.
I've seen all good people turn their heads each day, so satisfied I'm on my way.
And that's a really obvious cut right there. And this was back in the day. To be fair, a lot of this stuff was done back in the day when they printed all their effects to tape. So your reverb tail, because there are only so many tracks to go around. And so your reverb tails will get cut off.
The modern day version of that is people in reverberant spaces on YouTube talking, and they might cut out an or an which they might do a lot, but they cut it out in such a way that it goes on the next... it's horrible. What am I saying?
I know exactly what you're trying to say. Let's see if you... So you hear the first... So you hear the first part of the thing you would have missed because of pre-delay, essentially, coming in.
Yes.
And you hear the last thing cut out, and maybe even a zero crossing, going across a zero crossing boundary in a bad way, so it clicks on top of doing all that stuff.
On top of doing all that stuff. And it's common in a lot of very fast-paced YouTube videos. I think you can be fast-paced without doing that. I mean, I've not done many edits on mine, if any, and I do for Instagram, but not YouTube. And I go straight to camera. And for the most part, I don't and ah. I just speak, and it works. Today is an exception.
The other thing that's almost as bad is when people say, they have a whole lot to say, and then they take a breath, and that's fine. But every breath is a crossfade, and every crossfade is another thing. And so you think maybe there are actually 4 or 5 of these people talking to you about whatever it is that they're talking about.
Because one just isn't enough.
Nope, not at all.
It's weird. It's not a good thing.
No.
People.
Nobody wants that.
Nobody wants that.
No.
Let me think about other realism things that may bother you, like getting radio right. I mean, or even phone calls, because if I listen back to some of the early 60s and 70s dramas on the BBC, particularly Radio 4, if they're on the phone, they're not really, or if they are, it's sort of a dumbed down because they're in the next room across. Mm-hmm. You need to cut out that room noise somehow. You ever come across that one? Yeah,
we're not even talking about the realism of the actual fake landline or whatever they're using.
No, that's fine.
There's the, what do they call that? There's a name for it. The stage effect, I guess.
Oh, yeah.
Where it's like, on the radio for many, many years, you'll just have this thing where it's like, okay, the bottom end is filtered out and there's a peak somewhere and that's your phone. But wow, man, I tell you what, man, when I was on the phone, it never had highs like that. Oh, boy.
Oh, man, they do have beautiful highs, don't they?
No, they do. And the other thing is, of course, a lot of people will get this wrong too, like with walkie-talkies and stuff. One of the things, I'll be perfectly honest, I'm a ham radio operator. I have been for 25 years. And one of the things that I do, if for whatever reason I'm in a situation where I want something like that to sound like that, I don't emulate it. I use the real thing if I can. Actual conditions where things are noisy. Sometimes I'll go a little bit off frequency so it doesn't quite sound right, and then I'll patch the source in, and so it's... Conditions are never completely ideal. There was a thing that Derek Lane and I did years ago called AM Talk Zero, which is something he came up with and I expanded. And the idea behind that was it was a fake radio station, kind of a pirate radio station that existed on AM. And we were trying to figure out, well, he basically came up with the way to make this sound as realistic as possible. And by realistic, I mean it's a not very well calibrated AM transmitter with the right processing on it, and the radio you're listening to isn't quite on frequency, and it kind of has that AM sound, but in the background I had to make sure there were also there was also some interference from adjacent stations, and so I took a lot of time to craft the image that went around even the processing to make it so that you're not just listening to something that sounds like it's running through a bunch of processing. You hear the other little nuances around it as well, and that's I think kind of what made it what it was.
Good morning, everybody. This is AM Talk Zero Lexington. And I'm your host, Boris. We've been signed on now for the last 19 seconds. I think we're doing pretty good. Ready to start another wonderful broadcast day and another show. This is AM Talk Zero, and naturally, talk means just that, talk. None of that annoying music stuff, except for that annoying music stuff you're hearing in the background. And all that good stuff. Feel free to give us a call. We'll be right back after the news here on AM Talk Zero. AM Talk Zero, Lexington.
Reporting from the AM Talk Zero News Closet, this is Jeffrey Domino. The Federal Trade Commission has finally decided to act upon numerous complaints of crappy batteries that were made in China's Wingjiangdangdui province after several of them exploded in an American tourist's pocket.
It's pretty bad. I was just walking down the street down there, downtown Shanghai, and the batteries in my cell phone exploded, and then I died. I don't know what I'm going to do now.
It just keeps talking. It won't shut up. AM Talk Zero.
The person you are calling knows you are waiting. Please hold the line.
Ah, yes.
So we've talked about a lot of things that make you annoyed. Mm-hmm. What about the things when they are done right and done right well? Who inspires you? Because the whole, of course, premise is inspired by sound. So there'll be things and people that get it right. Who gets it right?
Well, okay, as far as dramas, as far as like radio dramas and stuff, the newer, and I say newer, I'm not really sure exactly when this started, but the later stuff from Big Finish, they did something, because they made a lot of those mistakes we were talking about before. But, you know, the thing that's funny about that was they did something. I don't know if they got new people in there and they fixed all that stuff, but they almost, not quite, but they almost like overcompensated in terms of, you see, remember when we used to have that reverb problem? Well, we don't have that anymore. And now we're going to add this whole 3D thing and, you know, stuff like that. But they did it right. I think they did it right. And I really, really like, okay, have you ever seen the movie Gravity by any chance?
No, but I should watch more movies. My wife always tells me this.
Yeah, I should too. But the sound design behind that, especially if you see it in, I saw it in the theater, if you see that in surround sound, it's absolutely amazing because I've been told the visuals match up really well with the audio, like they're floating in space and they're, the position that they are, you know, tracks exactly where they are in the spectrum, you know, in the 3D field, and they, you know, they just had all these really subtle things that you wouldn't really notice unless you were really looking for them, and it was just a really awesome experience. I like it when people immerse you in things that you don't think matter until they're not there. That's what I really enjoy.
Yeah, I get that with music making. Like getting the right sound for the job, it's important to me, and getting the right sound for a production is important.
Yeah, and it's like if let's say you're in a house and you're in a living room and there's not a whole lot going on. Well, there might be a refrigerator way off in the next room that you can just barely detect that's just right on the edge of your awareness. And, you know, if you put that in there, somebody's going to notice it. And if you don't put it, somebody's going to notice it. So,
yeah.
You know,
I've had that with breakdowns before, you know, like breaking down a track, you have this weird sound in that's hidden, but without it, there's a hole in the track. And this is true for production as well.
Yep.
And also reflections. If you have things in your living room, like a TV or a piano or a cabinet or something, having the slight reflections from that can make the world of difference. Otherwise, it sounds like you're in a barren room or something. So again, all these things make a huge difference to your overall production.
Oh yeah, that's another thing. Back to the whole let's be annoyed about things that a lot of...
It's easier to be annoyed than happy, I think.
Really
and this is true for a lot of things.
So you'll have people like, and the BBC is somewhat guilty of this, although not as bad as others. Again, I could go back to Big Finish for this, for some of their earlier things, is they put people in isopods so that, you know, there's no... interaction, no room noises, no whatever, and then they'll just stick people.
It's true more these days. They didn't do that before.
See, that's what I used to really like. So about the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the original series, you had people just hanging out in a room, hanging out near monitors even, and the microphones were even picking up the monitors. And the thing that's weird about that is you know, as an engineer nowadays, you go, oh my God, no, don't do that. Gosh, isolate the tracks. But that added something to it that wasn't there before. And I know this because there was a remaster of it where they cleaned all that stuff up, and it just seemed so sterile and weird without that. It was just
very
wrong.
clinical, yeah.
So back to this other thing. What a lot of these people seem to do, fortunately less these days, is they'll stick like 4 people on their own tracks, and they'll stick them somewhere Like, you go 50% left, you go 50% right, you're center, you're somewhere else. And then they don't put effects on them. And then everybody has dynamics processing. So like, okay, guy 1 might have his very own compressor. And for whatever reason, guys 2, 3, and 4 don't have their very own compressors. And there's nothing to diffuse the sound. And you're just literally listening to these little guys in boxes. And there's nothing to keep it together. And it's like, oh my God, really? You do all this other stuff and then you totally bomb this one.
I think actually one of the strangest things I remember listening to was James Follett's, one of his series, was it called Earth Search? That's the one. And if you have ever heard this, you hear the computers talking, number 1 and number 2, and they're panned, I think, pretty much hard left and hard right mostly.
Yep.
And if you listen to either side of those, the one that isn't speaking, you can hear the mic and the room noise there, but it's done in such an odd way. Like, I can't remember if I was impressed by it or annoyed by it. Have you ever heard this?
That kind of reminds me of the Mighty Boosh, actually.
Oh, the Mighty Boosh.
The Mighty Boosh.
Great name for a thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
I had to re-listen to that. But
yeah, and a lot of the older Monty Python stuff, actually, now that I think of it.
yes, because panning, it can get in the way, I think, a lot of time. And too much hard panning just ruins whatever it is you're trying to achieve, because no one ever sounds like that. And without effect, it's completely dead.
It really is. And then there's
Stick an impulse in there and call it a day.
Absolutely. And then one of my other things that was amusing, and it didn't annoy me so much as amuse me, because I kind of knew the circumstances around it. There was a low budget production thing there was 2 guys in Texas, and it was called M&J Audio Theater. They did stuff in the late 80s to about the mid 90s. And one of the things that always kind of amused me about this was the only reverb they had was a spring tank, a mono spring tank. And so you'd be out in the middle of, they would, be out in the open somewhere doing something, and then, let's go inside this cave. And then suddenly, we're mono now. The whole thing is mono because the reverb is mono. So naturally, we're just going to collapse everything else around it. I mean, at least they did that, because,
Consistency is key.
I mean, because if they kept everything else stereo, and I've heard they actually did do this on a couple of them. If they pan things out and then they have this mono, very obvious spring reverb in the middle somewhere, it's like, well, okay, that's going to take away from the experience. I mean, you can only do so much, but it was kind of amusing.
I've heard that on modern things, and
Yep.
I don't like that. That's not fun. That definitely can break your experience.
It can, but to be fair, if you're looking for that effect and you actually put it in the right context, it can work. Just don't do that and, expect people to believe it to be realistic.
And I'm sure you've come across this one as well. The one that annoys me quite a lot is a ringing phone with an obvious bell in it. As soon as you pick up that phone, the bell stops.
Well, I've heard that one.
Whoa.
I've heard that
Come on.
one. Yep. And the other one that I've heard is you're walking closer and closer to the phone and the bell stays right where it is and it's too far away. I've heard that one too.
Oh, yeah, I suppose I must have heard that and not even... Yeah, that's horrible.
Yeah.
And the wrong dial tone for the job. The wrong everything for the job, actually.
I haven't really heard so much the wrong dial tone from the job because I am in America and like everything is American. But I've heard like the person on the other end hangs up and then you get a dial tone. That doesn't happen. Not really. It used to under some circumstances back in the day, but modern stuff. You're like, hello, clicky, clicky. Oh, and you're hitting the clicky, clicky button and the dial tone doesn't cut in and out. Like, whatever.
That is not a good time.
No. Hello,
The last time
operator.
I experienced... Hello! The last time I experienced dial tone coming back in, actually, was when I was in Barbados. That was in the 90s, though. When the person hung up, it would cut and then switch to dial tone. So I didn't know that was no longer a modern thing. So that's interesting,
It
actually.
is. Well, there were switches, even through about the mid 90s or so that did that. But, there's still productions. Like I just heard one not very long ago. Actually, Family Guy had it. I mean, it's one of those things, again, you have to represent it somehow, I guess.
Yeah.
And be obvious about it. And I'm sure, in fact, it would be totally unsurprising for me to know that, there are engineers and writers and things out there that are going, I really don't want to do this, but it has to be made obvious somehow to people that don't know. And, what compromises can we get away with and who really cares at the end of the day and that sort of thing.
We do.
Yep.
And that's why Inspired by Sound is the whole point of it. We have standards and we'd like people to sort of share in some of those a bit.
Yeah, sure. We'll go with that.
We'll go with that.
It works for me.
So it's been kind of a long one. I don't want to end it necessarily, but my family is actually home, so I have to let them in the living room. Since my studio is the living room and kids are hungry, I unfortunately have to end this. However, if you have
Feed
some
the
other
kids.
last
You feed the kids.
Oh, my last question, I think, to you for now, maybe we'll come back to this and revisit you, is for people wanting to get into sound design and creation, where should they begin and what advice would you give them?
Well, let's see. If you want to start with things, my advice is to literally just, if you know anything, pretend you don't. Do whatever. Because when it really comes down to it, learning things like this is, I think, best done without any sort of rules. Because if you start off with some kind of foundation, like, okay, I have a pretty good theoretical background in audio engineering and how things work and what not to do, but I really didn't. I mean, for the longest time, I just did things, and if they sounded good, great. If they didn't, well, then I would figure out how that could be made better and try to work around it. But for something like sound design, really just play with stuff and then listen to things, listen to your environment, really pay attention to the finer points in life. But don't jump in necessarily expecting to get everything perfect right from the start, because I kind of made that mistake, and that's not really going to get you anywhere. But just experiment, just let it go, basically see what happens.
Yeah, because perfection will come with time.
Exactly.
And even now, the masters are not perfect. You can still strive for it, but you'll never attain it. And to be not attaining that is actually good for you, because it means you will always push further and further that envelope.
Yep, you have something to shoot for. And then when you do get better, you're like, oh, yes, I can still, there's still somewhere to improve.
I think we all definitely want that as artists and creators of all kinds. And that's why I wanted this channel not to be just about music, but about everything else as well that is sonically interesting. Well, thank you for being involved in this particular one and for editing your own podcast. This will be the first and last time you'll hear a podcast this good on this channel.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for giving me something to do. I mean, really.
Everybody wants something to do.
Yep.
And actually, we'll put it in the description as well, but if people want to find out more about you and where you are, how can they get in touch with you?
Well, I'm on Twitter. That's probably the easiest way to get to me is Boris in a box. That's 2 R's, by the way, because only 1 R is boring, and boring has 1 R, so having 2 is better than that. So it's Boris in a box.
That's a good slogan.
At BORRIS in a box. I'm also at Facebook, at facebook.com/Boris in a box. One of these days, I'll actually get around to resetting up my website. I do actually have some ideas of services that I'd like to provide and things like that, but the time just hasn't been really there to make it all happen. So at some point, you can go to perdue.audio and find something interesting. Right now, you can't because it won't give you anything interesting at all. But that's Perdue is my last name, Patrick Perdue. How about that?
How about that?
Yeah.
Well, there we are. Thank you for being involved, and we'll play you out with something that he decides, because I won't know. Bye.
Bye.